while my 29-year-old golden child brother Mike was raw-dogging my fiancée Sarah in our childhood bedroom and getting her pregnant 3 weeks before my wedding. My parents Tom and Linda were already planning how to convince me that forgiving this betrayal was my responsibility as the older brother who should set a good example by accepting that their precious son had stolen my life partner and destroyed my wedding. Because these things happen, and family sticks together no matter what. Not an accident or a moment of weakness, a calculated months-long affair where Mike systematically seduced the woman I was planning to marry while my parents knew something was wrong, but chose to protect their golden kid instead of warning their 32-year-old son that his fiancée was being stolen by his own brother in the house where we'd grown up. At 32 years old, I'd spent my entire adult life being the family scapegoat who got blamed for every problem while watching Mike get endless chances and unlimited forgiveness for behavior that would have gotten me permanently disowned. But discovering that my own parents would pressure me to forgive my brother for impregnating my fiancée was a level of family dysfunction that made me realize I'd been living in a psychological prison where my role was to absorb abuse so their golden child could avoid consequences. Every family gathering where I was criticized, while Mike was celebrated every holiday, where my achievements were minimized, while his failures were excused every birthday, where my needs came second to his wants. All of it had been preparation for this moment when they expected me to smile and accept the ultimate betrayal because protecting Mike's comfort was more important than my basic human dignity. Here's what made their manipulation absolutely insane. While Sarah was posting Instagram stories about complicated family situations and following your heart, and Mike was bragging to mutual friends about how she'd chosen him over me, my parents were calling relatives to explain that I was being unreasonable about a difficult situation that required mature family communication, acting like the victim of betrayal was the problem, while the cheating brother and home-wrecking fiancé were the ones who deserved understanding and support. What these sociopathic manipulators didn't know when they started showing up at my apartment, calling my workplace, and using family members to pressure me into forgiveness was that I'd already contacted a lawyer about restraining orders, started documenting every harassment attempt with screenshots and voicemails, and begun researching job transfers to Seattle, where I could build a life completely free from their toxic family system. By the time I finished explaining to a judge why I needed legal protection from people who thought brothers should forgive other brothers for stealing their fiancés, posted the restraining order documentation in our family group chat for everyone to see, and moved to a new city where none of them could find me. They discovered that scapegoat children grow up to control their own boundaries, and 32 years of absorbing abuse for the sake of family peace had taught me that some betrayals are so complete that forgiveness isn't just impossible, it becomes irrelevant when you choose total freedom over toxic family loyalty. To understand how my own parents could demand that I forgive my brother for impregnating my fiancée, you need to know that Mike had been the golden kid since the day he was born, while I'd been designated as the responsible older brother whose job was to make Mike look good and absorb blame when Mike's choices created problems the family couldn't ignore. From childhood, every family decision was filtered through what would benefit Mike's development and happiness. When Mike failed his classes, I got lectured about not being a better study partner. When Mike got fired from jobs for showing up late, I got speeches about setting a better example as the older brother. When Mike crashed his car, drunk driving at 25, somehow it became a conversation about how I should have been more involved in helping him make better decisions. The pattern was consistent and exhausting. Mike created problems. I absorbed responsibility, and our parents treated this dynamic as normal family functioning, rather than systematic favoritism that had trained one son to expect unlimited forgiveness while training the other son to expect unlimited blame. Every achievement I earned through hard work was minimized as what we expected, while Mike's smallest successes were celebrated like national holidays. By the time Mike hit 29, he'd been fired from more jobs than he'd successfully completed, had moved back in with our parents 3 different times, and had been bailed out of financial and legal problems that would have gotten me permanently cut off from family support. But he was still their golden kid, who just needed to find his path. Mike was always the golden kid who could do no wrong. My relationship with Sarah had been the one part of my life that felt completely separate from my family's dysfunction, a 2-year partnership built on actual mutual respect and shared goals rather than the toxic favoritism that had defined my childhood. Sarah was kind, ambitious, and seemed genuinely excited about building a life with someone who valued her opinions and supported her career dreams. We'd spent months planning a wedding that represented everything we wanted our marriage to be: thoughtful, inclusive, and focused on commitment rather than show. Sarah had picked out her dress. He'd arranged the venue, and we'd been looking at houses in neighborhoods where we could eventually raise children who would never experience the kind of favoritism that had poisoned my family relationships. The wedding planning had brought us closer together, creating inside jokes about seating charts and cake tastings that made us feel like a real team facing the future together. Sarah would call me during her lunch breaks to discuss flower arrangements, and I'd send her links to honeymoon destinations that made her laugh with excitement. I thought Sarah and I were building something real, but what I didn't know was that Mike had been systematically inserting himself into Sarah's life during the months when I was working extra hours to save money for our wedding and our future home. He'd started offering to help her with wedding planning when I was busy volunteering to pick up things she needed. When I couldn't get away from work, and positioning himself as the understanding, available family member who had time for her when her busy fiancé was focused on building their financial security. The pattern was familiar, even though I couldn't see it happening in real time. Mike identified something that mattered to me, figured out how to position himself as an alternative, and used his natural charm and availability to slowly steal what I'd worked to build. He'd done it with friends with job opportunities and with previous girlfriends who'd gotten tired of dating the serious brother when the fun brother was always around offering attention and spontaneous adventures. Our parents had not only enabled this pattern, but had actively encouraged it, treating Mike's ability to make friends easily and connect with people as positive qualities rather than predatory behavior that systematically undermined his older brother's relationships and opportunities. Mike had a history of taking what was mine. The discovery that destroyed my life came in the form of a manila envelope that arrived at my apartment on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before Sarah and I were supposed to walk down the aisle in front of 200 friends and family members who'd already bought plane tickets and booked hotel rooms for what was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. Inside the envelope was a 3-page handwritten letter from Sarah and a black and white ultrasound photo with her name printed at the top, and a date stamp that made my stomach drop when I calculated backward and realized she'd gotten pregnant right around the time she'd been helping Mike pick out a birthday gift for me while I was working late to finish a project that would fund our honeymoon. The letter was a masterpiece of self-serving confession disguised as guilt and accountability, explaining how she and Mike had connected during the months of wedding planning and how their feelings had grown stronger despite her love for me and her genuine desire to build a life with me. 3 pages of circular logic that boiled down to, I love you, but I love him more, and we're having a baby, so the wedding is off. The ultrasound photo was dated 6 weeks earlier, which meant the affair had been going on for months, while I was working extra shifts to pay for the wedding venue, the photographer, and the honeymoon vacation that was supposed to celebrate our commitment to spending our lives together. Every late night I'd spent at the office to build our financial security had been time Sarah spent with Mike, building a relationship that would end mine. Sarah's letter contained an ultrasound photo and a confession. What came next was the most insulting conversation of my adult life, delivered through a phone call from Mike about 2 hours after I'd finished reading Sarah's letter and calculating exactly how long they'd been betraying me while I planned our future together. Mike's tone was casual, almost bored, like he was calling to discuss weekend plans rather than the complete destruction of his brother's life. Look, man, I know this is weird timing, he said, with the kind of dismissive confidence that suggested he'd already decided this conversation was just a formality. But Sarah and I really care about each other, and honestly, it's probably better that you found out now, instead of after the wedding. He continued with explanations that sounded like they'd been rehearsed, talking about natural chemistry and feelings that couldn't be ignored, and how I should understand that sometimes people can't control who they fall in love with even when the timing is complicated. According to Mike's logic, stealing his brother's fiancée was just an unfortunate side effect of following his heart. When I asked him if he felt any guilt about destroying my wedding 3 weeks before the ceremony, his response was a shrug I could hear through the phone. Dude, it's better this way. You don't want to marry someone who's in love with someone else. I'm actually doing you a favor by being honest about what Sarah really wants. The complete absence of remorse was breathtaking. No apology for the betrayal, no acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused, no recognition that he'd systematically destroyed his brother's life through months of calculated deception. Just entitlement disguised as honesty and selfishness, packaged as doing me a favor. Mike said it just happened, and I should understand. The phone call from my parents came exactly 4 hours after Mike had finished explaining why stealing my fiancée was actually a favor, which told me everything I needed to know about how quickly our family's damage control system activated when their golden kid needed protection from the consequences of his actions. My mother Linda's voice carried the kind of forced calm that meant she'd already decided I was overreacting before the conversation started. Mike told us what happened with Sarah, she said, using the tone she'd perfected for managing family crises that threatened Mike's comfort. We know this is difficult for you, but these things happen between people, and the important thing now is keeping our family together during a challenging time. The phrase, "these things happen," was delivered with the casual dismissiveness of someone describing a minor scheduling conflict rather than a betrayal that had destroyed a wedding and a relationship. According to my mother's logic, my brother impregnating my fiancée was just an unfortunate coincidence that required mature family management rather than accountability for deliberate choices. My father Tom's contribution was equally insulting. Mike feels terrible about the timing, but you have to understand that love doesn't follow a schedule. Boys will be boys, and sometimes hearts want what they want. The mature thing to do is forgive and move forward as a family. The fact that Mike had systematically seduced my fiancée over months of calculated contact was reframed as spontaneous passion that couldn't be controlled. The fact that he'd destroyed his brother's wedding 3 weeks before the ceremony was minimized as unfortunate timing rather than deliberate cruelty. Mom said mistakes happen and family forgives family. What followed was the most manipulative hour of my adult life as my parents tag-teamed me with emotional manipulation designed to make me feel guilty for being angry about having my life destroyed by the two people I'd trusted most. The conversation took place in their living room, where I'd grown up watching them excuse Mike's behavior while holding me to impossible standards. But this time, they weren't just asking me to accept unfairness. They were demanding that I sacrifice my basic human dignity to protect Mike from feeling bad about the consequences of his own choices. Family sticks together no matter what, my mother explained with the authority of someone who'd never questioned her own logic. Mike made a mistake, but he's our son and your brother, and forgiveness is what families do when people they love make poor decisions. You're the older brother, and you need to set an example by showing that love is more important than pride. The circular reasoning was breathtaking. I needed to forgive Mike's betrayal to prove that I loved him. And if I didn't forgive him, it meant I was choosing pride over family loyalty. My devastation was reframed as selfishness, and my anger was dismissed as an overreaction that threatened family harmony. When I pointed out that Mike had spent months systematically destroying my life while I paid for a wedding that would never happen, my father's response was immediate. That's exactly the kind of attitude that divides families. Either you forgive Mike and move on, or you're choosing to put your hurt feelings above your family's well-being. We need to know where you stand. They gave me an ultimatum: forgive Mike or lose the family. The choice they were offering wasn't really a choice at all. It was a demand that I participate in my own emotional abuse by pretending that betrayal was forgivable, and that my pain was less important than Mike's comfort. They wanted me to smile at family gatherings where Mike and Sarah would flaunt their relationship, attend holiday dinners where their pregnancy would be celebrated, and act grateful for the opportunity to demonstrate my maturity by accepting the unacceptable. But 32 years of being their designated scapegoat had finally taught me to recognize manipulation disguised as love. And I realized that a family that demanded I forgive the unforgivable wasn't a family worth keeping. When I told them that forgiveness wasn't on the table and that I wouldn't be attending any family events where Mike and Sarah were celebrated as a couple, their disappointment felt like freedom rather than loss. I refused to forgive, so they cut me out. What made my family's betrayal even more devastating was how quickly Mike and Sarah moved from secret affair to public relationship, flaunting their pregnancy and their love story like it was something to celebrate rather than the wreckage of my life that they'd built their happiness on top of. Within 2 weeks of my wedding being canceled, Mike was posting Instagram photos of him and Sarah at restaurants where we'd planned to have our rehearsal dinner, her hand strategically placed on her barely visible bump, while he grinned like he'd won some kind of competition. The captions were masterpieces of selective storytelling, talking about unexpected blessings and following your heart, without mentioning that their blessing had been created through months of betraying the brother whose wedding venue was still holding our non-refundable deposit. My parents not only supported this public display, but actively participated in it, hosting family gatherings that celebrated Mike and Sarah's pregnancy, while I was explicitly excluded from events that had been family traditions for decades. My cousin Amy later told me that my mother had actually asked family members not to mention my name during these gatherings because it might create unnecessary tension during Sarah's delicate first trimester. The message was clear. Mike and Sarah's comfort was more important than acknowledging that their happiness was built on devastating betrayal, and my pain was treated like an inconvenience that threatened their ability to celebrate the golden kid's latest life milestone. They flaunted their relationship while I was excluded. When my refusal to forgive became clear and my absence from family events became permanent, my parents' approach shifted from manipulation to harassment, using every family connection and social pressure tactic they could think of to force me back into compliance with their vision of family harmony. The phone calls started coming daily, sometimes multiple times per day, with different family members taking turns trying to wear down my resistance. My mother would call crying about how my stubbornness was destroying our family and breaking her heart. My father would call with stern lectures about childish grudges and disappointing family values. Even my grandmother was recruited to call with guilt trips about how family is everything and life is too short for anger. Mike himself started leaving voicemails that alternated between fake apologies, "I'm sorry you're taking this so hard," and victim-blaming justifications. "Sarah was never really happy with you anyway." Each message made it clearer that his concern wasn't about the pain he'd caused, but about the inconvenience of having to deal with a brother who wouldn't forgive and forget on command. When the phone harassment didn't work, they moved to recruiting family friends and distant relatives to reach out and encourage me to work things out for the sake of family unity, turning every social connection into a weapon for emotional manipulation. When I wouldn't forgive, they started harassing me. The breaking point came when my mother, Linda, decided that my resistance to family pressure meant she needed to escalate to professional humiliation, showing up at my workplace during a busy afternoon to stage a public scene designed to shame me into submission. I was in the middle of a client meeting when my assistant knocked on my door to tell me that my mother was in the lobby demanding to see me immediately about a family emergency. When I came downstairs, Linda was already crying loudly enough for the entire reception area to hear, talking about how her son was destroying his family over a misunderstanding that could be resolved if I would just stop being so stubborn. The 20-minute scene that followed included accusations that I was mentally unstable for holding grudges, claims that I was abandoning family during a crisis, and demands that I call Mike immediately to apologize for making this situation worse than it needed to be. Yet my coworkers stopped what they were doing to watch my mother have a complete breakdown in our office lobby, sobbing about how I was choosing pride over blood. When security finally escorted her out, she was still shouting about family loyalty and forgiveness, making sure everyone in the building knew that her son was too selfish to support his brother during a difficult time. Mom caused a scene at my workplace demanding forgiveness. The evidence that would eventually protect me from my family's harassment started with Sarah's confession letter, which I'd kept in a folder along with the ultrasound photo. Not because I wanted to torture myself with reminders of the betrayal, but because something about the calculated timing and self-serving language had made me realize this might be important documentation rather than just personal devastation. Reading the letter again after the initial shock wore off, I noticed details that proved the affair had been far more systematic than either Sarah or Mike had admitted. She mentioned helping Mike with errands that corresponded exactly with days when I'd been working late advice sessions that had happened when she'd told me she was having dinner with girlfriends, and emotional support during times when she'd claimed to be too tired for physical intimacy with me. The ultrasound photo was even more damning because the date stamp proved she'd gotten pregnant during the week when I'd been working 16-hour days to close a deal that would pay for our honeymoon, while she'd been too stressed about wedding planning to see me more than once that entire week. Every sacrifice I'd made for our future had been time she'd spent building a relationship that would destroy mine. But the most revealing evidence was in the letter's tone and word choices, which read less like genuine remorse and more like damage control written by someone who'd been coached on how to minimize accountability while appearing to take responsibility. Phrases like, "Feelings grew stronger than we expected," and tried to fight the attraction were careful constructions designed to make deliberate choices sound like inevitable forces beyond their control. Sarah's letter was proof of months of betrayal. The harassment documentation I'd been collecting started as a form of self-protection, but became crucial evidence when I realized that my family's pressure campaign was escalating beyond normal family dysfunction into territory that might require legal intervention. Every voicemail from my parents was saved and time-stamped, creating a record of manipulation tactics that ranged from guilt, "You're destroying our family," to threats, "Don't expect any inheritance if you keep this up," to gaslighting, "Mike never meant to hurt you." The text message screenshots showed the progression from pleading to anger to outright emotional blackmail, with messages like, "Your grandfather would be ashamed of how you're treating family," and "Sarah's pregnancy is delicate, and your selfishness is creating dangerous stress." Mike's voicemails were particularly revealing because they showed his complete inability to accept accountability, even when he was supposedly apologizing. Messages that started with, "I'm sorry you're hurt," would inevitably evolve into justifications like, "Sarah was never really happy anyway," and "You should thank me for showing you who she really was." That each recording proved that his concern wasn't about the damage he'd caused, but about the inconvenience of dealing with consequences. The workplace incident had been witnessed by 12 co-workers and documented by building security, creating an official record of my mother's boundary violations and public harassment. The security footage would show her screaming about family loyalty in a professional environment, and the incident report would document her refusal to leave when asked, and her threats to make sure everyone knew about my family disloyalty. I documented every harassment attempt they made. The family support I discovered came from unexpected sources who'd been watching the situation unfold and were horrified by my parents' response to Mike's betrayal, giving me validation that my reaction wasn't an overreaction, but a normal response to abnormal family dysfunction. My cousin Amy was the first family member to reach out with support rather than pressure, calling to tell me that my parents had tried to recruit her for their harassment campaign, but that she'd refused because what Mike did was unforgivable, and anyone with eyes could see he'd been planning this for months. According to Amy, several family members had noticed Mike's inappropriate behavior towards Sarah during family gatherings, but had assumed I knew and was okay with it. Even more surprising was the call from Sarah's sister, Emma, who apologized for her family's role in the betrayal and revealed that she'd tried to warn Sarah against getting involved with Mike because everyone knew he had a pattern of taking things from his brother. Emma had witnessed several conversations where Sarah had specifically asked about my work schedule and my availability information that she'd clearly been sharing with Mike to coordinate their meetings. Both women offered to provide written statements about what they'd observed, giving me witness testimony that could support any legal action I decided to take against family members who refused to respect my boundaries. Even family members saw how wrong this was. The legal consultation that changed everything happened 3 weeks after my mother's workplace incident, when I finally accepted that my family's harassment wasn't going to stop on its own, and that I needed professional guidance about protecting myself from people who were treating my boundaries like suggestions they could ignore. The lawyer I met with specialized in restraining orders and family law, and her assessment of my documentation was immediate and clear. I had more than enough evidence to obtain legal protection against all 3 family members who'd been harassing me, and the workplace incident alone was sufficient grounds for a restraining order against my mother. Your family's behavior constitutes a pattern of harassment designed to coerce you into accepting treatment you've clearly refused, she explained while reviewing my folder of evidence. The fact that they've escalated to disrupting your workplace shows they're not going to respect your boundaries voluntarily. A restraining order would give you legal recourse when they violate your clearly stated wishes for no contact. She outlined the process for filing protection orders against my parents, and Mike explaining that the documented harassment witness statements and escalating boundary violations created a strong case for legal intervention. The restraining orders would prohibit all contact, including phone calls, text messages, social media, contact, workplace visits, and third-party harassment through other family members. My lawyer said I had grounds for restraining orders. The strategy I developed for ending my family's harassment campaign was designed to provide permanent legal protection while making it impossible for them to continue treating my boundaries like suggestions they could ignore whenever Mike needed defending or family harmony required my compliance. Filing restraining orders against my parents and Mike wasn't about revenge. It was about establishing legal consequences for people who'd proven they couldn't respect basic human boundaries, even after being told directly that their contact was unwelcome and their pressure was harassment. The documentation I'd collected provided more than enough evidence to obtain protection orders that would make any future contact attempts a criminal matter rather than a family dispute. My lawyer had explained that restraining orders would prohibit all forms of contact, including phone calls, text messages, emails, social media, interaction, workplace, visits, and third-party harassment through other family members. Violating a restraining order would result in immediate arrest and criminal charges, giving me legal recourse when they inevitably tried to continue their manipulation campaign. The orders would also include provisions preventing them from coming within 500 feet of my apartment and workplace, ensuring that my daily life could proceed without the constant threat of surprise confrontations or public scenes designed to shame me into submission. I filed for restraining orders against all of them. But legal protection was only half of my escape plan. The other half involved removing myself geographically from a city where my family had decades of connections, and where running into Mike and Sarah's social circle was an inevitable part of daily life that would make moving forward impossible. I'd already started researching job opportunities in Seattle, a city 3,000 miles away, where none of my family had connections, and where I could build a life completely free from the toxic dynamics that had defined my first 32 years. My company had a Seattle office that had been trying to recruit senior-level talent, and my manager had mentioned several times that a transfer could be arranged for the right opportunity. The plan was simple: secure the restraining orders. Accept the Seattle transfer. Find an apartment in a neighborhood where I could walk to work and start fresh, and begin the process of building relationships with people who didn't know anything about my history as the family scapegoat, who disappointed his parents by refusing to forgive the unforgivable. Seattle represented freedom from the constant expectation that I would sacrifice my well-being for Mike's comfort, and the 3,000-mile buffer would make it impossible for my parents to show up at my workplace or recruit local family members to pressure me into reconciliation. I planned to leave the city permanently. The choice to pursue complete family estrangement through legal and geographic separation would eliminate any possibility of future relationships with my parents or Mike, and I'd spent weeks considering whether the permanent loss of family connections was worth the freedom from harassment and manipulation. But 32 years of being treated as the expendable son, whose role was to absorb blame and provide forgiveness on demand, had taught me that relationships built on my utility as an emotional punching bag weren't worth preserving, regardless of blood ties or childhood memories that felt increasingly meaningless compared to the reality of how these people treated me when their comfort was threatened. The risk of losing family connections that had never valued my well-being felt less significant than the certainty of continued abuse if I remained accessible to people who saw my pain as less important than Mike's happiness and my boundaries as obstacles to their vision of family harmony. There was also the possibility that extended family members might choose to maintain relationships with my parents and Mike rather than supporting the family member who'd overreacted to betrayal by pursuing legal protection. But the support I'd already received from Amy and Emma suggested that people with functioning moral compasses understood exactly why I needed legal boundaries. I chose peace over family that didn't protect me. The courtroom hearing took place on a Thursday morning in front of Judge Patricia Martinez, who'd spent 15 years dealing with family harassment cases and had developed zero tolerance for people who treated boundaries like suggestions. I sat with my lawyer as she presented the evidence: Sarah's confession letter, dozens of harassing voicemails and texts, witness statements from Amy and Emma, and security footage from my workplace showing my mother's breakdown, designed to shame me into submission. Judge Martinez reviewed each piece with methodical attention. When my lawyer played voicemails where my father threatened inheritance cuts for choosing pride over family, and my mother sobbed about me destroying everyone's happiness, the judge's expression shifted to visible disgust. "This isn't family dispute resolution," she said, while reviewing the workplace incident report. "This is systematic harassment designed to coerce compliance from someone who's clearly established boundaries." When my lawyer explained the harassment stemmed from my refusal to forgive my brother for impregnating my fiancée, the judge's response was immediate. No one should be pressured to forgive betrayal, and family relationships don't override an adult's right to determine their own social contacts. These restraining orders are granted. The judge granted restraining orders against my entire family. 2 weeks later, Mike confronted me at the gym where I'd been working out for 3 years, apparently thinking he could intimidate me into dropping legal protection by staging a public scene. "This restraining order bullshit needs to stop," he said loud enough for the entire weight room to hear, positioning himself to violate the 500-foot requirement while other members stopped to watch. "You're embarrassing our family with this legal drama over something between me and Sarah." The irony of being lectured about maturity by someone who'd stolen his brother's fiancée was apparently lost on Mike, who continued his performance for the growing audience. "Sarah was never happy with you anyway," he continued, voice getting aggressive. "I did you a favor by showing you who she really was. You should be thanking me instead of crying to lawyers." When I pulled out my phone to call police, his tone shifted to threatening. "You call cops on your own brother, and you'll never be part of this family again." The gym's security cameras captured everything, including Mike's admission of deliberately violating the restraining order. Mike tried to intimidate me in front of witnesses. The following week, my mother decided restraining orders were just paperwork she could ignore during emergencies. She returned to my workplace claiming a family crisis required immediate contact despite legal restrictions. When security explained she couldn't enter due to legal orders, Linda staged an even bigger scene, screaming about how restraining orders were just paperwork that shouldn't prevent mother-son contact. "He's destroying his family over hurt feelings," she yelled, while security escorted her out. "His brother is getting married, and he's too selfish to put aside his grudge." The emergency was Mike and Sarah's engagement party, which my parents somehow thought I should attend, despite everything. When police arrived to arrest Linda for violating the restraining order, she was still screaming about family loyalty. Mom violated the restraining order at my office. The subsequent court hearing resulted in enhanced protection orders. Judge Martinez was swift and decisive. "The respondents have demonstrated complete disregard for this court's orders. Their behavior has escalated despite legal intervention. The enhanced order increased no contact distance to 1,000 feet, added criminal penalties for future violations, and made using third parties to contact me a separate criminal offense. Mike and Linda were ordered to attend anger management counseling and pay fines for violations. Family relationships don't override legal boundaries, Judge Martinez concluded. Adults have the right to determine their own social contacts, and that right is protected by law. The enhanced order would remain in effect for 3 years, giving me legal protection to build a life free from people who saw my boundaries as obstacles. The court enhanced my protection after their violations. 6 months after the enhanced restraining orders, I was living exactly the life I'd planned in Seattle, 3,000 miles from people who'd treated my well-being as less important than their golden child's comfort. The job transfer was seamless, and my new apartment was in a walkable neighborhood where I could build relationships with people who valued my company rather than my utility as an emergency resource. Therapy helped me recognize how family dysfunction had contaminated previous relationships, where my job was absorbing blame and providing forgiveness on demand. My coworkers became friends who invited me to hiking trips and dinner parties where no one expected me to smile, while they celebrated people who'd betrayed me. Seattle gave me the fresh start I needed. 2 years later, the restraining orders remained active and untested because my family had learned legal consequences were real. No phone calls, no texts, no surprise visits. The silence that initially felt strange became the foundation for peace I'd never experienced. Holidays became opportunities for new traditions with chosen family rather than obligations to endure emotional torture for DNA connections that had never protected me from abuse. I'd built a life where forgiveness wasn't required because those who'd betrayed me were legally prohibited from demanding access. Mike and Sarah's marriage lasted 18 months before divorce. According to cousin Amy, the relationship built on betraying me lacked foundation for surviving normal challenges without the excitement of destroying someone else's life. My parents' attempts to recruit extended family backfired when relatives questioned why they were being asked to harass someone with legal protection from his own family. But their consequences weren't my problem to solve. They'd become irrelevant to my daily life, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. I never had to forgive what was unforgivable.